fingers cut off for stealing a sewing needle. A cowboy bandaged each stump and gave her a trade. The bandages were the problem. I had clean ones, the good kind, boiled linen strips I kept in the near-side saddlebag for when a horse split its fetlock or a man caught a blade. 4 inches wide, and I was tearing them down to 1 because her hands were small. The stumps, 3 fingers on the left, 2 on the right, all taken at the second knuckle. They had stopped bleeding before I got to her. But they had not been cleaned, and they had not been wrapped, and she had been in the alley behind Kowalski's dry goods for what I later figured was close to 2 days. That is where I start, because that is where I have to start. Everything that came after comes from that alley. The whole shape of the rest of my life comes from that alley, and I have thought about it enough that I know there is no other place to begin. Her name was Dara Voss. I did not know that then. I knew she was young, couldn't have been more than 19, and that she was sitting with her back against the foundation stones with her hands held out in front of her like she was waiting for something to fall into them. Not cradling them, not hiding them, just out open, the stumps dark and crusted. And she was watching me the way a thing watches you when it has run out of the energy to be afraid. I crouched down. I asked her, could I see? She didn't say yes, and she didn't say no. She just kept her hands out. I worked slow. The alley smelled of old rain and hog lard gone rancid, and something sharp that was infection starting. I wet a cloth from my canteen, and I worked at the crusting, and she made no sound, none at all, which told me more about what she had already been through than anything she could have said. When you have screamed everything out of yourself, there is a kind of quiet on the other side of it. She was in that quiet. I said, this is going to pull, and I'm sorry. She said, I know what pulling feels like. That was the first thing she said to me. I want to tell you about Kowalski before I go further, because if I don't, you won't understand the town I was in, and you won't understand why what happened next was the shape it was. Kowalski was not a big man, but he was a man who had made himself into a kind of law in that part of Caldwell Street. He ran dry goods, and he ran a little money-lending operation behind the dry goods, and he had an arrangement with the marshal. Not a corrupt arrangement exactly, more the arrangement that exists between a man with money and a man who doesn't like trouble, which amounts to the same thing. He had his own sense of penalty, not the law's sense. His. The needle had been worth, I was told, about 3 cents. She had taken it because she did a little mending and altering for 2 of the saloon girls, and she had nothing, and she was hungry, and she thought she could take a needle and the thread, mind you, a spool of brown thread, and do enough work to pay for a week of meals. That was the size of it. That was the size of what she had done. Kowalski took it as theft. He had one of his men hold her, and he did the cutting himself with a cleaver he kept behind the counter for what he called deterrence. He told her she was lucky she had tried to steal something small. The marshal had looked at the paperwork on it and decided it was a civil matter. I don't need to tell you how I felt about that. I had been in Caldwell 3 days on a cattle contract I was close to closing. I was not from there. I had no stake in it. And I stood in that alley looking at what a man had done over a 3-cent needle, and I felt something go cold and flat in my chest that I had only felt a few times before in my life. The feeling that says, this one is yours to deal with. I finished the bandaging. She had a coat, thin thing, and I took mine off and put it around her. I said, can you walk? She said, where to? I said, I have a room at the Delaney. It's got a second chair. She looked at me for a long time. Whatever she was deciding, she decided it. She stood up. I will tell you about the next 3 days in pieces, because that is how I remember them, not as a line but as objects. The way memory is when you are paying attention to small things, because the small things are what you can do. The first object is the tin cup. I had one, enameled, the rim gone rough. I put broth in it, got it from the kitchen woman at the Delaney, woman named Cass, who had seen enough in her years that she did not ask me much, and I had to give it to Dara with both hands because she could not hold it alone. The thumbs were untouched, both of them, and the little finger on the right was there. Kowalski had taken what was in the middle, so there was grip some, but uncertain. I put my hands around the cup, and she drank. She said, you don't have to stay in here. I said, I'm not staying in here for you. I don't like the common room. That was a lie, and she knew it was a lie, and she said nothing. The second object is the mirror, small one on the wall, fly-specked. She sat in front of it the second morning and looked at her hands for about 10 minutes without moving. I was at the table going over the cattle papers, and I did not look at her, but I was aware of every second of it. Then she put her hands down in her lap and she said, not to me exactly, more like thinking out loud, she said, I used to do good work. I said, what kind of work? She said, sewing. I did good sewing. I could copy a dress pattern from just looking at it. I made 3 wedding dresses for women in. She stopped. She named a town I knew, a small one, 2 days east. I said, what happened there? She said, husband happened, and then no husband. And then here. That was all she said about that. The third object is the contract. I signed it the 3rd morning, got my money, could have left. The cattle were someone else's problem. I had a job waiting in Wichita, and I had told myself, riding into Caldwell, that I would be through this town and on in 4 days. I sat with the signed contract in my hands for a while. Then I folded it and put it in my inside pocket, and I went back to the room, and I told Dara I was going to be staying in Caldwell a while longer. She looked at me. She had steady eyes, dark with the particular steadiness of a person who has stopped expecting anything and is therefore not capable of being surprised. She said, why? I said, unfinished business. She said, I'm not your business. I said, I didn't say you were. I said, unfinished. She thought about that. She said, all right. There is a woman in almost every town of any size who knows what women need and who provides it without making a ceremony of it. In Caldwell, her name was Mrs. Elaine Prout, and she ran a seamstress shop on the better end of Front Street, the end that was not Kowalski's end. And she had 3 girls working for her who did alterations, dressmaking, some upholstery. I had been pointed to her by Cass at the Delaney, who seemed to know everything about everyone and offered it if you asked directly and kept it if you didn't. I went to see Mrs. Prout alone first. I told her about Dara. I told her about the hands. I told her what the hands still had, the thumbs, the one small finger, and I had watched Dara enough by then to know the grip was coming back, slow but real, the stumps toughening. And I asked her whether there was any work a woman like that could learn to do that was worth a wage. Mrs. Prout had the kind of face that has done a lot of arithmetic about people and doesn't show it. She listened to me all the way through without interrupting. Then she said, what is she like? I said, she's steady. She doesn't waste words. She had the skill before. Mrs. Prout said, can she be here Thursday? That was Tuesday. I said yes before I was certain it was true. I brought it to Dara that evening. I sat in the second chair, the way I had been sitting every evening. I had developed a habit of being in the room without crowding her, present but not pressing, and I told her what I had arranged. She was quiet for a while. She said, I can't hold a needle. I said, Mrs. Prout has needle holders, little wooden clamps. Her girl with the shaking hands uses them. She said, I don't want charity work. I said, it's not charity. She's short a pair of hands and she thinks yours might be worth something once they're mended. That was her word, worth something. Dara looked at the lamp. The flame was low, needed trimming. Outside there was the regular Caldwell noise, a horse, a man laughing, something breaking, the eternal sound of that town at night. She said, why are you doing this? I had thought about how to answer that. I had thought about it more than I would have admitted. I said, because someone should, and because I'm the one who's here. She said, that's not the whole answer. I said, no, but it's the part I know how to say. She looked at me then, not the careful animal look from the alley, something else. Something that was the beginning of a different look, though I didn't know it yet. She said, all right, Thursday. Thursday came and I walked her to Mrs. Prout's and I stood outside on the boardwalk for about an hour before I made myself go do something useful. I went to the livery, checked my horse, talked to the livery man about nothing in particular for a while, came back. She was still inside. I waited. When she came out, she was carrying something, a small folded piece of blue cloth, practice fabric, with 3 uneven stitches on it done with a clamp holder. She showed it to me. The stitches were crooked and too far apart. She said, Mrs. Prout says the first week is just relearning to think through the fingers I have. She says the hands know the work, the hands just need to find it again. I said, that sounds right. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, not looking at me, she paid me for the day. I said, good. She said it wasn't much. I said it was the first day. She said, yes. We walked back. She kept the piece of blue cloth in her better hand, the right, where the small finger was, held against her palm with the thumb. Not much of a grip, but enough. I want to tell you about Kowalski now. because I have been putting it off, and you have probably been wondering when I get to it. I did not go after him the way you might expect. There was no confrontation, no gun drawn in the street. That has never been how I operate. I have known men who solve things that way, and some of them I have respected, but it was never my method. My method is quieter and it takes longer, and when it is finished, the other person usually doesn't know exactly who finished them. What I did was this. I started asking questions, careful questions to the right people about Kowalski's money lending, about who owed him and how much, and whether the numbers he quoted to people matched anything on paper. I had over the years spent time with a lawyer in Abilene who had taught me a great deal about how property and debt work in a cattle town, and I knew what to look for. It took me about 10 days to find two men, a saddle maker named Tull, and a widow woman named Mrs. Calder who had borrowed against her property, who had what looked very much like fraudulent notes. Notes where Kowalski had changed the terms after signing. I went to a different lawyer, not the one in Kowalski's pocket, one who came out of Wichita twice a month on the stage. I will not bore you with the legal details. What matters is this. Within 6 weeks, Kowalski was facing a civil suit that had the potential to unwind a significant part of what he had built on Caldwell Street. The marshal who had looked the other way was caught in the crossfire of it. Neither of them came out of that year as well as they had gone in. I never spoke to Kowalski directly. I never wanted to. What I wanted was for the thing he had done to Dara to cost him something, and it cost him considerably more than 3 cents. Dara knew what I was doing. I had not told her, but she was not a woman who missed things. One evening she said, "You don't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "It won't fix my hands." I said, "No, it won't. But there ought to be a weight on the other side of the scale, even if it doesn't balance." She thought about that for a long time. Then she said, "I suppose there ought to." By the end of the 2nd month, she was doing real work for Mrs. Pruitt. Not the fine finish work, not yet, maybe not ever. Some of the detail stitching required what she no longer had. But she could do seams. She could do hemming with the clamp. She could do the structural work of a garment, the bones of it, and Mrs. Pruitt had discovered, and told me with some satisfaction, that Dara's eye for proportion was better than any of her other girls. That she could look at a woman and know where a waist needed to come in, where a shoulder needed ease without measuring. That was not in the fingers, that was in her. I watched her change in those weeks, not dramatically, slowly. The way ground changes when the frost finally lets go, you don't see it happen, you just notice one day that it has happened. She started eating full meals. She started talking more, not much more, but some. She had opinions which she had apparently been keeping to herself about a range of things, the quality of the beef in the Delaney dining room, the particular foolishness of a certain style of bonnet that had come into fashion, the way a man she had seen riding down Front Street had his horse's girth set wrong. She told me these things in the evening, sitting by the lamp, and I listened to them, and they were the best part of my day. That is not an exaggeration. After 30 years of cattle and trail, and the company of men who did not think much about bonnets or girths, the specific texture of her mind was remarkable to me. I had moved to a different room by then. I want to be clear about that. I had moved across the hall the 2nd week, once she had steadied, because it was the right thing and because I was not. I was not confused about the line between helping a person and taking advantage of the state she was in. She knew where I was. She could knock if she needed to. She knocked twice in those weeks, both times in the night. Once there had been a sound in the street that had startled her awake badly. Once she said she had just needed to know I was there. I opened the door. I said, "I'm here." She said, "All right." She went back to her room. I stood in the doorway for a while after, listening to the town. There came a morning in the 3rd month when I told her I had an offer of work in Wichita. This was true. I had put off writing back to the man making the offer twice already, and I could not put it off a 3rd time without losing it. We were at the table. Cass had brought up coffee. Dara was holding her cup the new way she had worked out, both hands, thumbs hooked, the cup cradled in the web of her palms, and she was looking at the window, which showed a piece of sky that had gone from gray to a thin, cold blue. I told her about the offer. I told her what it was. A trail boss position for a spring drive, good money, man I had worked for before and trusted. She was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "When would you leave?" I said, 2 weeks, maybe 3. She said, "All right." I said, "You're set here. Mrs. Prout will keep you on. You've got the room paid 3 months ahead. She said, I know. I said, you don't need me to stay. She said, I know that too. There was a long quiet. Outside a horse went by, slow, the hooves on the frozen street making a particular sound, each one separate. She said, do you want to go? I had been sitting with that question for 2 weeks. I had been turning it over and looking at the different faces of it, and none of the faces were the right shape for the answer I kept coming to, because the answer I kept coming to was no. Not because of obligation, not because I was worried about her, but because I had somewhere in 3 months of evenings by a lamp and bad coffee and the sound of her talking about bonnets and girths. I had come to want to be where she was more than I wanted to be anywhere else. That was a thing I had not expected. I had not been expecting anything. I had been a man who stopped expecting things some years back for my own reasons, and the not expecting had been a kind of peace, if not a warm one. I said, no, I don't want to go. She looked at me, full on, not sideways, not the careful, guarded look from the early weeks. She looked at me the way you look at a man when you are deciding whether to trust the thing he just said. I let her look. She said, then don't. I said, it's not that simple. She said, why not? I said, there are things you don't know about me. There are reasons I have been alone a long time. She said, I know you kept your hands steady in an alley when a woman you had never met needed bandaging. I know you have been patient in a way most men are not. I know you went after Kowalski without saying so and without asking for anything. She paused. She said, I know what I know. I said, that might not be enough. She said, I'll decide what's enough. She reached across the table. She put her hands over my hand, both of her hands, the stumps and all, the thumbs pressing down, and she held on, and she looked at me, and there was nothing performed about it, nothing added or dressed up. Just a woman choosing, plain and final, with everything she still had. I turned my hand over under hers. I held back. We were married in Caldwell in the spring, before the ground had softened all the way. Mrs. Prout was there. Cass from the Delaney was there. Untold, the saddle maker who had become a friend of a kind, was there. It was a small thing in a judge's office, and it suited both of us. I did not take the Wichita job. I wrote the man and said I was otherwise engaged, and he wrote back with something colorful, and I kept the letter. What I did instead was buy the building 3 lots east of Mrs. Prout's, which had been a feed supply that had failed, and I put money into it, not all I had, but enough, and Dara and Mrs. Prout together decided what it should be. It became a dressmaking operation bigger than Mrs. Prout's alone, with Prout on the fine work and Dara on the building work and the design. And over the following 2 years, it became the best operation of its kind between there and Wichita, which is not a small thing to say. I ran cattle. Not trail driving anymore, I was past that, and glad of it, but trading, brokering, knowing the herds and knowing the buyers and moving between them. I was good at it. I had always been good at it. The difference was that I was doing it out of a town where I lived rather than passing through towns where I slept, and the difference between those two things is larger than you might imagine if you have not done both. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I am done. It is about the needles. About a year after we married, Dara found a needle maker in Kansas City, a man who made specialty tools, surgical things, industrial things, custom orders, and she wrote to him a careful letter explaining what she needed. What she needed was a needle with a wide, flattened shank that would sit flat in the clamp, and a longer eye and a particular curve to the shaft. She described it in detail. She drew it. He made 3. He sent them along with a letter saying he had never had a commission quite like it and found it interesting. She threaded the first one herself. It took her a while. I watched her from the doorway of the workroom. She had not asked me to stay out. I just stayed back, and I watched her work the thread through with her thumb and what was left of her index finger, very slow, very patient. And when it went through, she held it up to the window light for a second before she put it down. I did not say anything. It was not the kind of moment that needed words. She looked over at me then, not the careful look from the alley, not the deciding look from the table, just the look she gave me across rooms, across distances, the look that said, "You are there, and I know you are there, and that is how things are." I leaned against the door frame. Outside it was a clear, cold afternoon, and the light was flat and bright the way it gets on the plains in late October, that particular light that throws no shadows and makes everything look exact. The sewing machines going. The smell of new cloth and something boiling in the back. My wife at the window with a needle she had made possible by asking for it. I had come into Caldwell with a cattle contract and 4 days to spend. That is a thing I still think about sometimes. The places you almost don't go. The alleys you almost don't walk down. I think about that, and I think about her hands over mine, and I know something about luck that I could not have told you when I was younger, which is that it is not what happens to you, but what you do about it and who you do it with, and when it comes you have to be the kind of man who doesn't walk past it. I was that day just barely that kind of man. And that was enough.